They say a house is more than just a place to live. It holds the echoes of its past. What if your dream home turned into your worst nightmare? Tonight, we'll explore 3 chilling stories of people who moved into their new homes, only to encounter the unexplainable, the terrifying, and the unforgettable. These are not ghost stories. They're real experiences shared by those who lived through them. So, turn off the lights, grab a blanket, and prepare yourself for 3 true scary new house horror stories. I had just bought my first home, a modest 2-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of town. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. After years of renting cramped apartments and saving every spare dollar, I finally had a place to call my own. The moment I stepped inside, a strange stillness seemed to settle over the air. It wasn't ominous, just heavy, like the house had been holding its breath for too long. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of excitement and nerves as I turned this old cottage into my dream home. The first few days were spent unpacking boxes and exploring every corner of the house. The creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and uneven windowsills gave the place a quirky charm. But there was one part of the house that unsettled me: a door in the basement. It was old, made of heavy wood, and locked. The seller had never mentioned it, nor had they provided a key. I figured it was just a storage area the previous owner had sealed off, maybe to store tools or junk they didn't want to take with them. I shrugged it off and moved on with my unpacking. At night, the house made noises. You know, the usual creaks and groans you expect from an old building. I wasn't surprised, it was the house settling, right? But every now and then, I'd hear something else. Faint and distant, like a soft tap or shuffle coming from the basement. At first, I barely noticed it, too distracted by the chaos of moving in. But as the days passed, I couldn't ignore it. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the old pipes or maybe even rodents in the walls. I'd deal with it later. The locked door kept creeping into my mind. Every time I went down to do laundry, I felt its presence, standing there at the far end of the basement like it was watching me. The scratches around the frame didn't help. They were faint but deep enough to make me wonder what could have caused them. A dog? A previous tenant with too much time on their hands? I didn't want to think about it, so I avoided the door altogether. After all, some mysteries are better left unsolved, or so I thought. The strange noises didn't stop. They got worse. What had started as faint tapping or the occasional shuffle from the basement turned into something louder. At first, I told myself it was still just the old house settling. But then, late at night, I started hearing sounds that were harder to explain. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Once, it even sounded like furniture shifting down there. I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was all in my head, but every time I passed that locked door, it felt different. The scratches on the frame caught my eye more often now, and I started noticing details I hadn't before. They were jagged, uneven, and not something that looked like normal wear and tear. I tried not to think about it too much, but the image stayed with me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. Then came the night everything changed. It was just past midnight, and I was getting ready for bed. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt too deep, too still. As I turned off the lights, I heard it, this time unmistakable. A loud, grating sound, like a chair being dragged across a concrete floor. My stomach dropped. The noise was coming from the basement. For a moment, I froze, my hands still on the light switch. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced through all the logical explanations I could muster. Maybe something fell. Maybe there was a raccoon or a stray animal that had somehow gotten inside. Whatever it was, I needed to check. With a shaky hand, I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and made my way downstairs. The basement door creaked as I pushed it open. The air inside felt colder than usual, and the faint smell of damp earth filled my nose. I stepped down carefully, one slow step at a time, the wooden stairs groaning under my weight. When I reached the bottom, the beam of my flashlight landed on the locked door. Only, it wasn't locked anymore. The door was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stared at it, trying to remember if I had somehow left it that way. No, that door had always been locked. I was sure of it. But now it hung open, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond the frame. The sound of a chair scraping against concrete made my heart drop. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I stepped closer. With every step, the cold air seemed to grow heavier, pressing against my chest. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, slowly pushing it open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing in the silence. And then, there it was. A small, empty room I'd never seen before. At first glance, the room looked empty. The flashlight's beam swept across the bare concrete floor and walls, revealing nothing but dust and cobwebs. But then, in the far corner, I saw it. A small bundle, wrapped in what looked like an old piece of cloth. My breath hitched as I approached it. Kneeling down, I carefully unwrapped the fabric, revealing a stack of old photos and a few brittle, yellowed papers. The photos were faded, their edges curled from age, but the faces were clear. A man, a woman, and a little girl, smiling in front of a house that looked eerily familiar. It was my house, but years ago, before the paint had started to peel and the garden had been overtaken by weeds. My hands shook as I sifted through the photos, each one showing the family at different times. Birthdays, holidays, moments of joy frozen in time. The letters, written in looping, elegant handwriting, were harder to decipher. But one thing was clear. They told a story of loss, pain, and fear. One letter ended with a chilling line. "If anything happens to me, it's not an accident." A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly stood up, clutching the bundle to my chest. The air in the room felt heavier now, almost suffocating. That's when I heard it, the noise, louder this time, a scraping sound that seemed to echo from the very walls around me. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I was plunged into darkness. And then, I saw it, a shadow. It darted across the far wall of the basement, faster than I could follow, disappearing into the corner. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest as I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. I could barely breathe, my eyes locked on the corner where the shadow had vanished. Was it my imagination? A trick of the light? Or was there something? Or someone? Down here with me? I didn't wait to find out. I bolted upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on my bed with the lights on, staring at the photos and letters, trying to make sense of what I had found. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I called the police and handed over everything I had discovered. The investigation didn't take long. The officers returned to the basement, this time with tools and equipment, and what they uncovered still haunts me to this day. Hidden behind one of the walls of that locked room, they found human remains. The body had been there for years, sealed away and forgotten. The police confirmed that it belonged to the woman in the photos I'd found. Her death was ruled suspicious, but the case remains unsolved. I moved out immediately after that. I couldn't bear to stay in that house for another second. Even as I packed my things, I could feel it, the weight of everything that had happened there pressing down on me. The thought of sleeping under the same roof where a life had been taken. It was unbearable. The noises stopped after the police finished their investigation and sealed off the basement. Or maybe I just wasn't around long enough to hear them anymore. But I still can't shake the memory of those sounds. The faint tapping, the scraping, the shadow on the wall. Were they echoes of someone begging for help? A warning? Or something far worse, lingering long after it should have been gone? I'll never know. The photos and letters haunted me for weeks after I left. I couldn't get those smiling faces out of my mind, especially the woman, the one whose life was taken in the very place I'd called home. I found myself wondering what her final moments were like, whether she knew she'd never leave that basement. Did she scream? Did anyone hear her? Did they care? All I know is that house wasn't meant to be lived in. It had too many secrets, too much pain buried within its walls. The day I handed over the keys was the first time I felt like I could truly breathe again. But even now, I can't completely escape it. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet and still, I think I hear it again. the faint sound of a chair scraping against the floor, as if the house is still trying to tell its story. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's to trust your instincts. If a place feels wrong, it probably is. And if you ever find a locked door in a house you've just bought, maybe it's better if you never find the key. When my wife and I moved into our suburban dream home, we couldn't believe our luck. It was everything we'd been searching for. A cozy 2-story house with a big backyard for the kids to run around in. A quiet street where cars rarely passed by, and neighbors who waved every morning as they watered their lawns or jogged by with their dogs. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. A fresh start. Our neighbors were welcoming from the very first day. Mrs. Jenkins from next door brought over a pie as we unpacked. The Harris family down the street invited us to their barbecue the following weekend. It was like a scene from one of those idyllic TV shows. But across the street, at the very end of the cul-de-sac, was Mr. Andrews. And he was different. From the moment we arrived, Mr. Andrews stood out. He never came over to introduce himself or waved like the others. His blinds were always drawn, no matter the time of day. His yard, though neatly maintained, felt lifeless, as if it were just there to blend in with the neighborhood. At first, I told myself he was just private. Everyone has their own way of living, after all, but then we started noticing the oddities. Late at night, when the street was quiet and the houses were dark, Mr. Andrews would come outside, dragging heavy black trash bags to the curb. Not unusual on trash day, except it wasn't trash day. And these weren't regular garbage bags. They were tied up tightly, almost too tightly, and he handled them as if they contained something he didn't want anyone to see. I remember standing by the window one night, watching him under the faint glow of the streetlights. He looked around nervously before dropping the bags and hurrying back inside. When I mentioned it to my wife, she laughed it off. Maybe he's cleaning out his attic, she said. But there was something about the way he moved, so hurried and deliberate, that didn't sit right with me. Still, I brushed it aside. After all, I wasn't about to let my suspicions ruin the excitement of our new home. But even then, in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Mr. Andrews. It started with our dog, Max. He's usually calm and friendly, the type of dog who loves everyone and everything. But at night, something changed. Almost every evening, as the neighborhood grew quiet, Max would stand by the living room window, staring across the street at Mr. Andrews' house. His ears would perk up, and then, without warning, he'd start barking furiously, low, guttural barks, the kind I'd never heard from him before. At first, I thought it was just the typical dog thing, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But night after night, it was the same routine. Always the same house. One night, Max's barking woke me up around 2 in the morning. I stumbled out of bed, bleary-eyed, and found him standing at the front door, growling. I looked outside, and at first, everything seemed normal. The street was quiet, the houses dark. But then I noticed it. A faint flickering light coming from Mr. Andrews' basement window. It wasn't like the warm glow of a lamp or the blue hue of a TV screen. It was erratic, almost like the light of a candle or an old bulb on its last legs. I stepped closer to the window, squinting through the darkness. The flickering continued, casting faint shadows on the wall behind the glass. And then I heard it. Muffled sounds, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the hum of a machine or the creak of old pipes. It sounded like voices, low, murmuring voices, as if someone, or several someones, were talking just beneath the surface. My heart started to race. I told myself it could be anything, a late-night project, maybe he was watching an old movie in his basement. But the way Max was reacting, the way my stomach churned with unease, it didn't feel right. I remember sitting back down on the couch, staring out the window as the flickering light danced across the basement wall. It's none of my business, I told myself. People are allowed to have their quirks, right? Not everyone has to fit into the mold of a perfect suburban neighbor. But the more I tried to convince myself, the harder it was to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. Something wasn't right in that house. I just didn't know what it was yet. It was late, well past midnight, and I had just finished locking up for the night. My wife and the kids were already asleep upstairs, and the house was finally quiet. I walked to the front window out of habit, just to check on things before heading to bed. That's when I saw it. Across the street, in one of the basement windows of Mr. Andrews' house, something moved. At first, I thought it was just the shadows from the trees swaying in the breeze, but then I saw it again. It wasn't a shadow. It was a person. I stepped closer to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The dim light in the basement was flickering again, casting an eerie glow, and that's when I saw her, a young woman. She was pressed up against the glass, her face pale and panicked, her hands pounding on the window. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. She looked directly at me, her mouth moving as if she were screaming, but I couldn't hear a sound. It was like the world had gone completely silent, except for the thundering of my heartbeat. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what I was seeing, but the words came out in a rush. There's a woman. She's trapped in my neighbor's basement. She's banging on the window. Please, you need to send someone now. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line, but when I looked back at the window, the woman was gone. The light was still flickering, the basement still glowing faintly, but the window was empty. I scanned the house, half expecting to see her somewhere else, but there was nothing. The street was quiet, still, as if nothing had happened. I started to doubt myself. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me after weeks of unease? But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The police arrived quickly, their lights flashing silently in the dead of night. I watched from my living room as two officers approached Mr. Andrews' door. He answered after what felt like an eternity, looking as calm as ever, even as he spoke to them. My stomach twisted as I watched him shake his head and gesture toward his house as if to say, "There's nothing here." The officers seemed unconvinced. One of them asked to go inside, and after a tense moment, Mr. Andrews stepped aside to let them in. What followed was a blur of activity. More police cars arrived, their lights casting eerie red and blue flashes against the houses. Officers emerged from the basement, their faces pale, their voices hushed as they called for backup. I stepped outside, unable to stay in the house any longer. One of the officers saw me and walked over. His expression was grim. "You did the right thing by calling us," he said quietly. "We found something disturbing." It turned out that Mr. Andrews had been keeping people captive in his basement. Women who had disappeared from nearby towns over the past several years. The woman I'd seen banging on the window, she was one of them. She had been held there for weeks, waiting for a chance to escape. And that night, she had come so close to freedom, close enough to be seen. They found evidence. Chains, locks, and rooms that had been soundproofed to keep his secrets hidden. It was horrifying to think about, and as the police led Mr. Andrews out in handcuffs, he passed by me without a word, his face devoid of any emotion. It was as if he didn't care about the lives he'd destroyed or the terror he'd caused. After that night, everything changed. Mr. Andrews was arrested, and the news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Reporters swarmed the street, their cameras capturing the house that had hidden so much darkness for so long. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another before now gathered in small, hushed groups, their faces pale with disbelief. Everyone asked the same question. How could this have gone unnoticed for so many years? My wife and I tried to settle back into our routine, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The young woman at the window, her desperate face staring back at me. And every time I wondered how many others had been there before her. How many had been trapped behind those walls, waiting for someone to notice, for someone to help. The police told me I had done the right thing by calling them, that my decision had saved lives. But it didn't feel like enough. The guilt gnawed at me, the thought that I had seen the signs. The odd hours, the strange behavior, the flickering light, and I hadn't acted sooner. I convinced myself it wasn't my business, that it wasn't my place. And because of that, those people had suffered longer than they needed to. Eventually, we decided to move. The neighborhood that once felt like a dream now felt tainted. the shadows of what had happened lingering in every corner. But even in a new house, in a new town, the memories stayed with us. Some nights, I wake up to Max barking, and for a split second, I think I see that flickering light again. Other nights, I dream of her, of all of them, trapped, waiting, hoping. The nightmares, I've realized, aren't going away anytime soon. I can't help but wonder how many lives could have been saved if someone had noticed sooner. If I had noticed sooner. It's a thought that stays with me, a weight I'll carry for the rest of my life. And it's a reminder that sometimes the things we ignore, the things we tell ourselves aren't our business, are the very things that matter the most. After everything I had been through, moving into that duplex felt like a fresh start for my family. It wasn't much, but it had charm. Original hardwood floors, a spacious kitchen, and just enough room for me and my 2 kids. It felt like the kind of place where we could finally settle down, where things could finally start to feel normal again. At first, everything was perfect. Emma, my youngest, loved her new room, even though it was smaller than what she had before. My older son, Jake, spent most of his time outside exploring the backyard, while I slowly worked to unpack the endless boxes. For the first few days, the house was filled with the kind of chaos that comes with moving in. Lots of laughter, a bit of bickering, and that hopeful feeling that this place could be home. But then Emma started talking about the whispering lady. First, I didn't think much of it. She was only 6, and she had always had a vivid imagination. She'd tell me, "The lady says goodnight to me," or "The lady asked me where my toys are." I assumed she was talking about a doll or maybe even an imaginary friend. It wasn't until a few nights later that I started to feel uneasy. Emma ran into my room, clutching her blanket, her little face pale and tear-streaked. "Mommy, the whispering lady's in my room. She's mad at me," she said, trembling. I scooped her up and reassured her, telling her it was just a bad dream. But I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just the overactive imagination of a little girl adjusting to a new place. Kids make things up, right? But over the next few days, Emma kept pointing out odd things. She'd tell me she heard footsteps in the walls, or that she saw shadows moving in the corners of her room. And each time, I'd laugh it off, trying to be the rational adult. Still, late at night, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I couldn't help but notice the stillness, the weight in the air that I hadn't felt before. I started to wonder if Emma was imagining things, or if I was ignoring something I didn't want to admit. At first, I convinced myself that Emma's whispers and shadows were just part of her adjustment. But then I started hearing things too. Late at night, when the kids were fast asleep, the house would fall silent, too silent. And in that silence, I began to hear faint whispers. It was so soft at first that I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't just noise. It was a voice, and it was saying my name. The whispers weren't constant. They came and went, but each time, they seemed closer, more deliberate. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind slipping through an old vent, or maybe the neighbors next door were just noisy. But deep down, I knew better. I'd feel my heart race every time the whispers came, and I'd sit frozen in bed, straining my ears, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Then there were the other sounds, scraping noises, faint thuds, as if something was moving inside the walls. One night, as I was sitting on the couch with a book, I heard a distinct knock. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it came from the far corner of the living room wall. I stared at the spot, clutching the book tighter, and when the knocking stopped, I thought it was over. But then Emma called from upstairs. "Mommy, the whispering lady is in the hallway." I rushed up the stairs, finding Emma standing in the doorway of her room, her little hands clutching her stuffed bunny. She was shaking. I picked her up, held her close, and carried her into my room, trying to calm her. "There's no lady, sweetheart," I whispered. "It's just us here." But as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them myself. The breaking point came a few nights later. I was patching a small hole in the wall in the upstairs hallway, just a simple repair I'd been meaning to get to since we moved in. As I worked, my hand slipped, and the drywall cracked slightly, revealing something odd. Beneath the plaster was a small, dark gap, a crawl space I hadn't known existed. My curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight, I peered inside. The space was cramped, dusty, and suffocatingly dark, but it wasn't empty. Inside, I found a pile of old, decaying belongings. Broken toys, torn clothes, and yellowed papers. I pulled out what seemed to be a journal, its cover brittle with age. The pages inside were filled with neat handwriting, but the words sent chills through me. It belonged to a woman who had lived in the house 20 years ago. Her entries started out mundane, describing her life and her husband, but they quickly turned dark, detailing fights, fear, and her desperate attempts to hide from him. The final entry simply read, "If you're reading this, please find me." I sat there, frozen, the journal trembling in my hands. My flashlight began to flicker, and I swear I heard it then. Right there in the crawl space, the faint, chilling sound of a woman's voice whispering my name. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that wrapped around me like a thick fog. I kept hearing the whispers, the soft, chilling voice that seemed to call my name from inside the walls. And the more I thought about it, the more the journal's words haunted me. Please find me. What had happened here? What had I uncovered? The unease grew every night. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. But there was more. One evening, while I was trying to settle down for bed, I heard a loud crash outside, followed by frantic knocking on the window. My heart leaped into my throat. I rushed to the window, pushing the blinds aside, and what I saw nearly stopped my heart. There, in the fading light of the evening, was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. She was pounding on the window, screaming, but no sound came from her mouth. It was as if she was trapped behind a glass barrier, unable to make any noise. She looked directly at me, her expression pleading, desperate. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. I grabbed my phone and ran down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I dialed the police as quickly as my trembling fingers would allow. "There's a woman. She's on my window. Please, she needs help." But by the time the police arrived and I rushed them to the window, the woman was gone. No trace, no sign of her. As if she had vanished into thin air. The officers searched the property, but they found nothing. It was just me, my kids, and the house. Quiet as if nothing had happened at all. But the sinking feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. I had seen her. She had been there. And somehow, I knew she hadn't been the only one. The next morning, I called in a contractor to inspect the crawl space again, to make sure everything was structurally sound. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I needed answers. The contractor pulled back the drywall, and it wasn't long before his expression shifted from casual interest to one of shock. "I don't know what you're hoping to find here," he muttered, "but you should probably call the police." He pointed to a spot deep within the crawl space, where the wood had been disturbed. Beneath the rotting belongings, buried under layers of dust and broken toys, was something far worse than I could have imagined. There, partially concealed, were bones, human remains, hidden away for what seemed like decades. The police arrived in force, conducting their investigation. And it was then that the full truth came to light. The woman whose journal I had found, she had been murdered by her own husband. He had kept her captive in that very crawl space, and over time, he had hidden her body, waiting for the right moment to dispose of it. But she had never escaped. Her cries had gone unheard, her pleas unnoticed. And as for the whispers, well, they had been her voice, trapped in the walls, desperate to be found. The husband had long since disappeared. No one knew where he went, but the police were certain that he had left town, perhaps even years ago. But the legacy of his crime had lived on in the house, in the whispers that had tormented my family. The woman had never left, and in the end, neither had her anguish. We moved out of the house immediately after the police had finished their investigation. The thought of staying there any longer, in that place where so much horror had unfolded, was unbearable. We packed up as quickly as we could, But even as we left, the house seemed to loom behind us, its presence heavy in the air. I remember looking back one last time before I got into the car, and I swear I saw something. A shadow moving in the window. It was her, I'm sure of it. The whispering lady. To this day, Emma refuses to talk about her. She won't even look at the pictures we took in that house. It's as if she's trying to block it all out, to forget. I don't push her. In fact, I've never brought it up again. But deep down, I know what we experienced wasn't a figment of our imaginations. The whispering was real. The shadows were real. And the woman, her suffering, her death, was real too. I can't help but think of the woman sometimes. She's never far from my mind, especially late at night when I'm lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to sleep. I wonder how many others had passed through that house over the years, unaware of what had happened there. How many people had heard the whispers but never understood what they meant? How many lives could have been saved if someone had listened? But in the end, the only thing that kept us going was the fact that we escaped. We got out before anything worse could happen. And Emma? She's doing better now, thank God. But I know she'll never forget that house. None of us will. I don't know what's worse. The fact that a woman's life was taken in that house, or that her spirit was left behind, trapped in the walls for so long, crying out for someone to help her. I don't know if she's found peace yet, but I hope she has, because I know I'll never truly forget the whispers